Welcome back, everybody. Good to see you. I hope you're having a great day so far, wherever you're at, whenever you're watching this recorded lecture. So, today we have another important session for our world religions class this term. Um, Let me just kind of give you the breakdown of where we are. So, we've now covered 7 major world religious traditions. We've gone from Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, the Chinese traditions, and then just now recently the Japanese religious traditions. So we've covered really the major categories of all different significant religious perspectives globally. Of course, there are some like just smaller indigenous religions or, that don't have as many global adherents that couldn't possibly make the cut, but the vast majority of human beings that believe in one religious view or another, we've talked about all the views, their histories, their sacred people, times, places, views about the divine, death and the afterlife, and the relationship of society and religion and their histories. So it's been an interesting journey through the world of the world's religious traditions, but we still have a little bit more material to cover. So the last unit of our course that's going to take us through till the end has to do with looking at different arguments that have been written throughout history, which try to prove that God exists. So we want to know now what are these arguments that have been written, and in what way do they, make their case for God's existence. So I want us to kind of think about the different areas of identity that a person can have when it comes to the question of whether a person believes in God. So there's three major positions on the question of whether God exists or not, and every person fits somewhere within this three-way division. So let's just discuss that for a minute. So what I have written here says three positions on the existence of God. What are three different views that people have on that interesting and much debated question, whether God exists? Okay, so one point of view is the view known as theism. Theism. And theism, you may have heard the term or know what it means in general, but theism is basically a person who believes that God exists. So let me put it as a noun, or let me refer to the adherent of it. So let me call it theist. Theism is the belief system, and theist is a person who adheres to it. So theism is the doctrine that God exists. A theist is a person who believes that. So theist, person who believes that God exists. Okay, just as we have, like other isms which refer to a philosophy or worldview, and then ist used to refer to a person that holds that. So, like Buddhism, a religious position, a Buddhist, one who follows the doctrines of Buddhism. So, theist, a person who subscribes to the idea that God exists. They believe that there is a God. And defined in this way, theism spans across all of the different religious categories that we've talked about. It doesn't mean that it's only a Christian who is a theist or a Muslim or a Jew. It's anybody who believes in the existence of a God or gods. So that's one major position. And that's the majority position of most people in the world. There is a small but healthy minority of people that don't believe this. But if we were just looking at statistical tables, that you would see that in pretty much most all places around the world, the majority of people are theists. So theism or theist, a person who believes that God exists. On the other hand, there are those that take the opposite position, which is atheist or atheism. So an atheist is a person who, you might be able to guess, does not believe that God exists. So Okay, so some people just don't feel that that is true. Maybe they don't think the evidence is strong enough, or maybe they think that there are actually logical contradictions built into the whole idea of God. But for one reason or another, there's a significant number of people out there, and it's a growing share of the world and even domestic population of people that are not affiliated with religion, that they just don't think that there is any such thing as God. Sorry. Just a little sneeze. Yeah, so atheist, a person that does not believe that God exists. They're not convinced by any of the arguments. They just don't see that it's true, or at least that's their view. Now, there's sometimes a third position that people talk about. So let me mention that one too. The third possibility is agnostic or agnosticism. Okay, so an agnostic is a person who sort of straddles the divide between theism and atheism. This is a person who neither affirms nor denies the existence of God. So they sort of, as we say, they suspend judgment on the question. They take no view, positive or negative. They just say that they're uncommitted, that they suspend judgment. Why? Usually it's because they think that there's not enough available evidence. So they think that there's not sufficient evidence to prove it or to disprove it. So they just don't take a position on the matter. So a person who suspends judgment, meaning that they just don't take a stance, suspends judgment. And why? Because of a perceived lack of evidence. Okay, so that type of person would say, not sure, maybe, maybe not, but I'm not going to say either way because I just don't see enough evidence to prove it or to disprove it. So they just don't take either stance. So you can think of these three viewpoints when it comes to whether God exists. You know, one affirms it, one does not affirm it, and then the other person is like uncommitted. I've heard some say that they don't necessarily agree that agnosticism is a genuine third position, because some people feel that a person who's an agnostic is still a kind of atheist because they don't express an affirmative belief in God. But I do think that this three-way division makes sense, and it's often the way that's presented in just theoretical discussions of the topic. Okay, so well, people all can be sorted into either of these three categories. If somebody's a believer, they're a theist. If they are a firm disbeliever, they're an atheist. And if they're just an uncommitted, then they would be an agnostic. An agnostic doesn't say there is no God, they just aren't sure. So you're going to be a person that's somewhere along the spectrum of possibilities, depending on how your views are. And what we're now going to do is we're going to consider some of the most powerful arguments that have been written throughout history from the theist camp. So we're going to try to learn from the most respected authors in Western history who've tried to make a logical defense of the existence of God. People have tried to present reasons and give their thoughts as to why they claim you can prove that God exists. We're not sure if these arguments are good or bad yet. We haven't yet learned all of them, but we're going to survey the most powerful and historically significant arguments for that conclusion. And then when we're done with those, we will take stock of the other side and look at what objections have been raised against those arguments by skeptics, by atheists, and even in some cases by believers who, even if they believe in God, didn't necessarily find favor with the arguments that they were looking at. Okay, so the first author that we're going to survey or review from the theist category who tries to prove that God exists is this man. So I'm going to clear this away, and we're going to learn about our author for today's lesson. All right, so here's an important philosopher, theologian, and statesman from about 1,000 years ago. So the man's name is Saint Anselm. So Saint Anselm was a theologian, scholar, who lived from 1033 ACE until 1109 ACE. That's his lifespan right there, that you can see listed. So that's a long time ago. Right now it's 2023. So he was born 990 years ago. And in 1077, he published a book. And this book from 1077 is called the Proslogion. Okay, so Anselm. So about Anselm, by the way, he was the Archbishop of Canterbury, which is like a government position over there in England. So aside from being a scholar and a theologian, he was also a statesman. Later on, after he died, he was canonized in the Catholic, well, this was before the Protestant Reformation, so it was just a unified Christian church, but he was canonized as a saint in the church. That's why he has this title of Saint Anselm, so he's one of those important saints in the lineage of saints. Okay, so Anselm lived during this time period. In 1077, he published and wrote his book, the Proslogion. Inside the Proslogion, there's this famous argument for God's existence, and that's really the subject of what we are going to focus on today. And it's called the ontological argument. I know this is kind of a big vocabulary word. Don't worry too much about that, but it's just the name of his argument, which tries to prove what? That God exists, the ontological argument. If that's a little difficult to read anyway, it says ontological. Onto, and then the word logical. Ontological argument. The word ontological comes from a Greek word which means being, ontos. So this is like an argument that God exists based on what type of being that he is thought to be, or what his definition is. Okay? So just setting up our discussion here for the moment and letting you know about the author, his lifespan, the date that he published this important paper from, or book rather, and then the argument within it that we're focused on. I sent to you guys a PDF which just contains the relevant section of his book that has the ontological argument in it. It's a short reading. It's only 2 pages. So, and even though it's a bit of a dense piece of philosophy, I hope that you have the chance to read that and all the other documents that I've posted as well. Those are assigned readings. Okay, so St. Anselm's ontological argument. We're going to now really dive into the details and get clear about what this is. Okay, so the first thing I think we should talk about as we start to build up the elements of this argument, it's what is the definition of God generally speaking? Like what kind of being or what attributes really is God thought to have? Because that's an important element of the argument that the author here presents. So let's go over that. What are, classic attributes that people often associate with the being of God? All right. So I'm going to just create a little section on the board here that talk about attributes of God. Okay, so attributes, we're talking about like characteristics or features, qualities that would ordinarily be assumed to be true of God. And as you're watching this, I challenge you to think for a moment, if you can. If you had to define what God is like to a person who's asking you about the concept, suppose that you had like a small child that's just getting their start in life and they don't even understand the concept of God, so you have to try and tell them about it. What would you say? And a couple of things seem to pop out, right? One of them is that God, if we ever think about what God is like, we think of God as a being that is powerful, but not just powerful to a limited extent, but powerful to an infinite degree. So like infinite power. And there's a word for that. The word is omnipotent. So here we go. One of the qualities of God is to be omnipotent. Sorry here. Omnipotent. And the word omnipotent, again, it just means all powerful. Okay, the word breaks down etymologically into 2 roots: omni, which is a reference to all, and potent, which refers to power, like potency. So God is all-powerful. Let me just mention a few points on that. People think of God as a being that has infinite power to do anything. God can create, the world. He can create the universe. He can determine what happens. So if something's possible, they say that God has the power to do it because God is unlimited in his power. So it's not like there's something that would go beyond the powers of God to be able to do. Anything conceivable, God's able to do that. So he's not just a finite being with certain limitations, some things that go beyond his abilities. They say of God that he can do all things. So he's omnipotent, all powerful. Another quality of God to add, so not just omnipotent, but they also say that God knows things, that God is wise, but not just to some finite degree, like a smart person, but that he's infinitely knowledgeable. So he's also all-knowing. And there's another vocabulary term that refers to that, and that's omniscient. Omniscient. O-M-N-I-S-C-I-E-N-T. Omniscient. That means all-knowing. This comes from other root words. Scientia is from Latin, which originally means knowledge. It's also the root of the word science. So all knowledgeable, having all knowledge. So to go together with being all powerful, it is said that God is knowledgeable, so that he knows everything. Nothing is a surprise to him. Nothing escapes his notice. God, they say, knows all things, from the smallest details to the biggest picture. He has, they say, a plan, and that he determines all events. So nothing can escape the all-seeing eye of God. He knows all things. He knows how things work. He knows what's happening in the world or what things exist. He knows the detailed facts about every single element of reality. So God, they say, is not just partially knowledgeable, and some things he has to still research or figure out. That would be like us that have a finite intellect. But they say God's intellect is infinite, so infinitely vast that it covers everything and he knows all the things. So omnipotent, omniscient, and let's go forward with another. They also say that God is good, not just that he's powerful and knowledgeable. He is that way, but they say that he's not just like some evil force or some malevolent force that has all this power and knowledge, but that he is good, benevolent, generous, kind, that he is infinitely moral and righteous. So there's a word for that too, and the word for that is omnibenevolent. Okay, so all good, omnibenevolent. So God is thought to be just a perfect example of a moral being. He's as good as a person could possibly conceive of, infinitely good, without even a touch of immorality or, vice or evil. And then one last. So together with God being all powerful, all knowing, and all good, it's also said that he exists eternally and that he's always existed, and that he's also somehow at all places at all times. Me and you, we're only in one place at a given time. Right now, I'm on the campus of Orange Coast College, and you're watching this wherever you are, but you're not in a number of different places all at once. If you're on the West Coast, then you can't be on the East Coast and the West Coast both at the same time. But they say that God is somehow present in all places across reality. So he's somehow suffused throughout all of reality. There's no place where God is not present or where his presence can't be found. So God is also, they say, omnipresent, which means present at all places and times throughout the universe. So omnipresent. Okay, so we're only present at a particular place in space. That's me and you. But God, they say, is present everywhere. Also, when it comes to time, go back 100 years, and me and you were not here. We're here now, but maybe in another 100 years, I don't know. Maybe we won't be here anymore. But so we have a limited time and space to exist in. God, though, they say, exists for all time. There's never a time at which he doesn't exist, and that he's also present everywhere. So that's omnipresent. So now, going back to the argument here by Anselm, Saint Anselm. He says, when you think about God and you conceive of, what kind of being he is, you come to think about qualities like these, And he doesn't mention all these qualities in precise detail, but he kind of summarizes them in this way. He says that what they all sort of add up to or amount to is that God is thought of as the greatest conceivable being. So I'm going to just sort of add that to our board so that becomes clear enough. God is thought of as, so if you just kind of summarize all these points together, God is the greatest conceivable being. The greatest conceivable being. So, if there's a being, just a thing that is infinitely powerful, knowledgeable, good, and present, it would seem that that's the greatest being you could possibly think of. So conceivable just means able to be thought of or contemplated. And so Anselm goes with that basic characterization. He says, anybody who thinks about God recognizes that the idea of God, at least at the level of the definition, is that God is defined as the greatest conceivable being. There is no being that can be thought of as greater than God. So God's the greatest thing you can think of. Now, the phrase greatest conceivable being is the phrase that he uses, that I like to use as I teach the material, but I just want to point one small thing out. If you looked at that reading that I sent, you'll notice that sometimes he slips into this perhaps odd way of putting that phrase. He sometimes says it in this somewhat indirect form of grammar. He says, God is thought of as the being than which none greater can be conceived. So like this is the same as that. But I don't want you to be too confused by the wording because it is a little bit strange wording. So the greatest conceivable being is AKA the being than which, I mean like by comparison to, none greater can be conceived. Okay, so God, the greatest conceivable being, or in his chosen phraseology, he sometimes says it that other. Now, the next step of his argument is this. He says, well, who is it then that has this idea of God in their mind as the greatest conceivable being? We had the three different categories of viewpoint on the existence of God on the board earlier: theist, atheist, agnostic. And who among them holds this definition of God in mind as the greatest conceivable being, or the being than which none greater could be conceived? Well, certainly theists would say that, because you say you believe in God, and the thing you believe in is this great being, right, to an unlimited extent. But Anselm points this out. He says it's not only theists who define God as the greatest conceivable being, it's also everybody else, because whether you believe in God or not, you can at least agree that that's the definition of the concept of God, right? So an atheist and a theist can kind of shake hands and agree on one thing at least. What is the definition of the word God at a minimum? Because, they don't disagree that God by definition is the greatest conceivable being. The thing that divides the theist and the atheist is just whether that being actually is real or whether it exists in reality. So that's his first little point of leverage, I guess you could say, as he builds up his argument. He says, okay, starting off, God is overall thought of as the greatest conceivable being. And then he continues by saying, and by the way, that is a view of God that everybody has in common, universally. It's not just theists who define God in that way, but it's also all the atheists of the world too. They may not believe in God, but they know that that's what the kind of word God means. In the same way, so I hope that makes sense to you. God is thought to be the greatest conceivable being, and even if you didn't believe in God, you'd have to at least concede that's the proper definition of the word. Okay, so let me read you then a little bit of the author's words from the text that I sent to you guys through Canvas on this argument. So it says here. Now the selection that I sent to you begins with Anselm directly addressing God, and so he speaks to God here. He says, "Well then, Lord, you who give understanding to faith, grant me that I may understand as much as you see fit, that you exist as we believe you to exist, and that you are what we believe you to be. Now, we believe that you are something than which nothing greater can be thought. Or can it be that a thing of such a nature does not exist? Since," and then he quotes from the scriptures, the Psalms, where it says, since, quote, the fool hath said in his heart, there is no God. Now he continues, he says, but surely when this same fool hears what I am speaking about, namely something than which nothing greater can be thought, he understands what he hears. And what he understands is in his mind, even if he does not understand that it actually exists. Because it is one thing for an object to exist in the mind, and another thing to understand that an object actually exists. Okay, so let me explain that now a little bit more as we continue going through it. By the way, just a point to mention, he uses this label, the fool, to refer to the atheist. He's quoting from Psalms where it says, the fool has said in his heart, there's no God. And then he just kind of appropriates that label as a generic term to use to refer to atheists. Of course, it's not a nice thing to call a person a fool because they don't believe in God or because they don't agree with maybe your position on religion. So I'm not trying to give license to that term. It's just that's what he said in the essay that he wrote. So anyway, long story short, he says there's this idea of God as the greatest conceivable being, and basically everybody knows that that's the right idea of God. Even the fool who doesn't believe in God understands this idea in his mind as the right idea, at least, of God. And he just doesn't think that the being actually exists. Okay, so the next section of his presentation continues by him talking about this. He says there are some things that only exist in the mind alone, but then there are other things that exist in both the mind and also in reality. So I want to try and help you understand that distinction really fast by just putting a little diagram up here on the board. Okay, so I'm just drawing a little divider, and on the top left, I'm labeling the heading of it, exists only in the mind. And on the top right column, I'm heading this one, and it says exists in both the mind and in reality. Okay, exists only in the mind, that's this section. Exists both in the mind and also in reality, that's going to be in this section. So let's think about it. What are some things that only exist in the mind? What I mean by that is things that are not real, things that are just imaginary or make-believe, like fictional things that don't actually exist in, the real reality we are in. So there's definitely things like that. So one example could be the idea of a unicorn. Like a horse that has a horn protruding from its forehead. That is not a real thing. That's just a mythological creature. But of course, we could talk about such a thing. It's just that it isn't real. It's only, a fiction, a creation of the mind. So maybe a unicorn could be one of those, or I don't know, like a dragon. There are lizards and there are reptiles, but there's no flying reptiles that are like these, like dragons would be. So that's another, only existing in the mind. I don't know. Name, any of the characters from the Marvel comics or comic book universe. Like the X-Men, for example. They're fun on screen, as sort of storybook characters, but they're not actually real people, and don't really exist. They're only in the mind. We can keep going, but I hope you're starting to get the picture. I don't know, what if I added like the Tooth Fairy, something that we talk to kids about, but we all know there's no real such thing as a Tooth Fairy, so it's only in the mind. It's not a real thing. Okay, on the other hand, though, there are things that exist both in the mind, but then also in reality because, they're real. So this is an easy column to fill in, I hope, because it's just things that really exist. You can think about them in your head, but even if you didn't, they would still exist outside of your head because they're objectively real. They're not just a fictional construct. So like, I don't know, take the moon, for example. The moon out there that's orbiting around our planet, that's not just a fiction of your imagination, but that's a real thing that exists outside of your mind too. Or what about, instead of a unicorn, just a regular horse? We can think of a horse, or we can see one out there in the field because it's a real thing and it's not only located in, the mental world of imagination. I don't know, how about, like, say, the Eiffel Tower, the wonderful, cultural monument over there in Paris, France. Are you thinking about it? I bet you are, just because I've talked about it, but of course it's something that really exists as well. So again, we can keep adding to this, the White House, the Great Wall of China, or any other number of things. But the point just is that there are some things that only exist in the mind, other things that exist in both the mind and also in reality. Okay, now here's the question that Anselm poses to you next. He says, well, what would be greater? What would be like a greater level of greatness? To only exist in the mind, or to exist in the mind plus reality too? And in his view, don't overthink it too much. It's greater to exist in both, because it's, two is greater than one. It's like if you exist in the mind and in reality, then you have whatever greatness comes from existing in the mind, but on top of that, you have this additional greatness that comes from really being real. Okay, so his view is that when distinguishing between what's greater, it's greater for something to exist in both the mind and in reality. Now let's revert back to the earlier comment about what is the definition that he thinks everybody has of God. You may remember now that God's thought of as what? The greatest conceivable being, meaning then there's nothing that you could conceive of or imagine that's greater than God. So if he's the greatest conceivable being, would he exist only in the mind, or in the mind and in reality? And Anselm is saying this, that since he's the greatest conceivable being by definition, that means that according to the definition, he has to exist in both the mind and in reality. Why? Because it's greater to exist in both. If you're the greatest thing that anyone could imagine, and it's greater to exist in the mind and in reality than to only be in the mind, then you have to have that element of greatness, because otherwise, if he was only in the mind, he would not be the greatest conceivable being, and then that would contradict the definition itself, which is a paradox. So again, following the steps of the logic, everybody already knows God is defined as the greatest conceivable being. Whether you're an atheist or a theist, you can say you know that that's what the word God refers to, at least by definition. Then he says some things only exist in the mind, and then there's others that exist in the mind and in reality, like examples that you see back there. But it's greater to exist in both the mind and in reality than to only exist in the mind. So, since God is the greatest thing conceivable, he must exist in both, because if he only existed in the one, then he wouldn't be the greatest conceivable, and that would violate the accepted definition that even atheists suppose is a correct definition. Now let me read you a little bit of his comment on the same that I've tried to explain here just in the class. He gives an example. Let me just sort of set that up before I read on. He says, imagine a painter, right? And this painter is they're going to paint a painting, but they're just in the brainstorming phase. They're thinking about the painting that they want to make, but they haven't yet started to actually apply paint to the canvas. So it's purely in their mind, right? Maybe they have the idea for a painted image that nobody's ever created before. So at first, the painting's only in their head. It's just a thought. But then suppose that this painter goes forward and they really execute the painting. They create the painting that they thought they would like to make. Now, after the painting is done, the painting's not only in their mind, but it's also out there in the reality on the painted canvas. So it's greater to exist in both the mind and in reality than to only exist in the mind. Like another case, I don't know, this is maybe just a slightly different example, but personally, I've not yet had children. I think about having them. I sometimes plan to down the line a little bit, but they don't yet exist. So far, they're not real. But maybe one day I would have these children. And then what started off as just a thought or an idea becomes real. Now, isn't it greater, the state of existing in both the mind and in reality, than to be merely a thought process or an idea at first? So then in that case, again, God, defined as the greatest thing of all that you could ever imagine, would have to, in order to fit that description, exist in the mind and in reality, because quite simply, that's greater than only the mind. So let me read on then. He says here, it's one thing for an object to exist in the mind, and another thing to understand that an object actually exists. So when a painter plans beforehand what he's going to execute, he has the picture in his mind, but he does not yet think that it actually exists because he has not yet painted it. However, when he has actually painted it, then he both has it in his mind and understands that it exists because now he has made it exist. Even the fool then, atheist in his way of using the term, even the fool then is forced to agree that something than which nothing greater can be thought exists in the mind, since he understands the term whenever he hears it, and whatever is understood is in the mind at least. And surely, that than which a greater cannot be thought cannot exist only in the mind, because if it only existed in the mind, it could be thought to exist in reality also, which would be greater. So, if that than which a greater cannot be thought exists only in the mind, then this same that than which a greater cannot be thought is that than which a greater can be thought. But this is totally impossible. Therefore, there is absolutely no doubt that something than which a greater cannot be thought exists both in the mind and in reality. So you see there the basic crux of his argument. It's all based on the definition of God as the greatest conceivable being, and then this additional point that is made, that it's greater to exist in the mind and in reality than to only exist in the mind. Putting those two parts together, he thinks this establishes that God has to really exist. He's not just in your head. He's not like those fake things like unicorns or tooth fairies or dragons, but he's more like the things to the right on this column, because he's something that's not only like an idea, but is also objectively real outside of your mind. Again, why? Because defined as the greatest conceivable being, and knowing that it's greater to exist in both as opposed to one, that kind of locks in that he has to exist in both, because otherwise he wouldn't have all that extra greatness that the greatest conceivable being would have to have by definition. So it's a bit of a tricky argument, right? He's trying to say that if you understand the meaning of the word God as the greatest conceivable being, then you cannot deny that God exists, because it would be like saying the greatest conceivable being is not the greatest conceivable being to say he didn't exist. Because to exist is part of the greatness that contributes to him being the absolutely greatest conceivable being. Now, if he had just stopped it at that stage, I mean, it's still got problems. Some of the aspects of the argument could definitely be challenged, and we will talk about, objections to it down the line. But he continues on the next page, and he extends the argument a little further in a way that I kind of find as at least a little more perhaps controversial. So on the back page of the assigned reading, he goes on to say, okay, he thinks he's now already proven the existence of God, again, because of the definition of God as the greatest conceivable being, plus the related idea that it would be greater to exist in the mind in reality than only exist in the mind. So he can't just be a fiction of the mind. But then on the second page, he says, in addition to this, God cannot even be thought not to exist. Okay? Now, let's say that phrase one time slowly, because it's a bit of a tongue twister, but it's something that I want you to understand. He says, God has to exist in the mind and in reality, but also beyond that, God cannot be thought not to exist. So that means, it's like a double negation. The thought that God does not exist, he is saying that's impossible for anybody to think. Nobody can think that God does not exist. Now, why does he say that? Because it's one thing to establish the existence of the being. It's a different thing to try and establish that it's not even possible to think otherwise. Okay? So why does he say that it's not possible to think God doesn't exist? Here's why. It's the same reasoning that he used before, but he just repeats it for this example. He said, okay, so if something can be thought not to exist, like you could imagine it not existing, that is less great than a thing which could not be thought not to exist. Okay, so for example, me, I'm a person, and as you know, I'm your professor. I can think of myself not existing. It's a sad thing to think about, but I can imagine, me getting sick and dying, or, getting hit by a bus or some random thing, and I can imagine those things happening. If that happened, I wouldn't exist, unfortunately. But the idea he's got here is that God is too great to be able to even be thought of as non-existent. So you can think of the planet Earth getting hit by an asteroid and blowing up and not existing any longer, or a car being smashed and then taken to the junkyard and melted down, doesn't exist any longer. But he says you cannot imagine God not existing, because if you could, that would take away from how great that he is. And it's impossible to do that because he's the greatest conceivable being, so he can't be diminished in any way. So again, here's his logic. It's greater if something can't be thought to not exist than if it could be thought not to exist. And since God is defined as what? The greatest conceivable being, that means that he must be something that you could never think of as non-existent, right? Because there's a comparative greater greatness for things that can't be thought non-existent, as opposed to things which can be thought non-existent. So the conclusion of this piece of reasoning is that on top of God being a thing that exists in the mind and in reality, according to the definition that he's the greatest conceivable being, furthermore, he cannot even be thought not to exist. All right, now I've tried to make that point to you in straightforward, clear language. Now I'm going to read to you a little bit of the author's words. Keep in mind, I mean, this was written almost like 1,000 years ago, so some of the language used in his writing, it's just a little bit old-fashioned, and it's got that antique quality from the medieval period. But let me read it. It says here, and certainly this being so truly exists that it cannot be even thought not to exist, because something can be thought to exist that cannot be thought not to exist, and this is greater than that which can be thought not to exist. So, if that than which a greater cannot be thought can be thought not to exist, then that than which a greater cannot be thought is not the same as that than which a greater cannot be thought, which is absurd. Something than which a greater cannot be thought exists so truly then that it cannot be even thought not to exist. Okay? And you, Lord God, he talks to God again, you, Lord, are this being. You exist so truly, Lord, that you cannot even be thought not to exist. And this is all as it should be, because if some intelligence could think of something better than you, then the creature would be above the creator and would judge the creator, and that is totally absurd. In fact, everything else there is, except for you alone, can be thought of as not existing. You alone, then, of all things, most truly exist, and therefore, of all things, possess existence to the highest degree, because anything else does not exist as truly, and so possesses existence to a lesser degree. Why then did the fool say in his heart there is no God, when it is so evident to any rational mind that you of all things exist to the highest degree? Why indeed, unless because he was stupid and a fool? Okay, so he kind of gets a little off the rails there at the end, chastising the quote unquote fool that's the non-believer. But his point, I hope you could see through some of the convoluted language, the essential idea, which is not that difficult, really. He's just saying that it's greater, basically, if something can never be thought of as non-existent. And so, in keeping with God's absolute greatness, the greatest conceivable being, he must be something such that he could never even be thought not to exist. Because if you could think of him as non-existing, that would diminish how great the being is. Because if you compare the two cases, here's something that I can think of as not existing. Here's something that I could never think of as not existing. It's greater to be incapable of being thought not to exist. So therefore, that's the way God is. Now we have 2 points established according to the author's, satisfaction. Number one, that according to the definition, greatest conceivable being, which everybody accepts, God has to exist in the mind and in reality, because that's greater than only the mind. And then on top of that, he cannot even be thought not to exist, because things that can be thought not to exist are not as great as things which could never be thought not to exist. So God exists outside the mind, and he's also in reality, and he can't be thought not to. Now, there's a logical strategy of argument that the author is using here, which has a technical name, and I kind of want to make that clear to you as well. Just a brief side note about what's called reductio ad absurdum. Okay, so here we have this concept from logic and from argumentation. Reductio ad absurdum. Okay, so reductio ad absurdum. That means in Latin originally to reduce something to absurdity. And here's how that format of argumentation works. So you want to prove something is true, and you start by assuming the opposite of what you would like to prove. You then try to show that if that was the case, that something absurd, impossible, or contradictory would be implied by that. And if that can be shown, then what you wanted to prove is in fact true. So again, you want to prove something, so you assume the opposite of that something. And then you show that this opposite assumption would lead to something impossible, which is enough to prove that your original claim is in fact true. So here, I'll put that. One assumes the opposite of what they would like to prove, okay, that's step one. And then, step two, show that this would lead to something absurd or impossible. Okay, So, like, here's an example. Suppose that I want to prove that the world is not flat. Okay, that's my view. It's not flat. If I'm going to use the reductio method to show this, what would be the first thing that I would assume? Well, if you follow the description there, I would have to start by assuming the contrary of what I want to prove. So since I'm interested in proving that the world's not flat, my first move with this method would be to assume, for the sake of argument, as they say, let's suppose that it's flat, right? And then I would have to show that on that basis, something absurd, ridiculous, or impossible would be implied by that. And that would be enough to show that that's false, and therefore it's not flat. So let's go through that reasoning. I tell you the Earth's not flat, but let me prove it. Assume that it was. Well, if it was flat, then things would fall off of the edge of the Earth because it would basically be a flat disk instead of a round globe. But that's absurd, and we know that doesn't happen. So therefore, it's safe to say it's not flat. Okay, another example along the same lines. I want to show it's not flat. Let's assume that it is. Well, if it is flat, then that means that there should be no such thing as different parts of the planet where there's sun and other places where it's dark. Because if it's a big flat disk, then the sun would be exposed to the whole surface of that disk at once, as opposed to a rotating globe, which only shows a part of the spherical surface to the sun's light at a given time. But we know that there are parts of the world right now where it's nighttime and other parts where it's daytime. So clearly that's absurd. Therefore, again, it's not flat. Okay, so notice what I did there. I wanted to prove it's not flat. So I just say, for the sake of argument, just for a moment, let's say otherwise, to the opposite, that it is flat. Then I try to expose how that would lead to something that's utterly ridiculous. So that's enough to determine that the original claim that I'm trying to show is in fact true. So you want to prove something, you assume it's opposite, you show that opposite thing leads to something ridiculous. So that means your original view is the case. Now with Anselm, he uses this twice over. He says, okay, well, God has to exist in the mind and in reality. But let's assume that he didn't. If God only existed in the mind, for example, then he would not be the greatest conceivable being. But that's absurd, and that violates the definition of God itself. So therefore, he does not only exist in the mind. Notice what we did there? We said, let's show that he does not only exist in the head. And then he says, well, so assume that he did. If he did, he wouldn't be as great as he's defined as being. So therefore, he has to exist in the mind and in reality. And then in the part 2 of his argument, he says, well, God, he cannot be thought not to exist. But suppose that he could be thought not to exist. If he could be thought not to exist, then he wouldn't be the greatest conceivable being. And again, he thinks of that as absurd because it's a contradiction to the definition itself. So therefore, God must be something that cannot be thought not to exist. Okay, now there's just this final part of his little selected reading that I gave to you. And so I want to cover that now as we finish this out. At the end, he returns back to a point that some of you may have been wondering about. So he's now made the case, he's tried to argue that God cannot be thought not to exist. But if God cannot be thought not to exist, then how could there be people, we've talked about earlier, atheists? Those are people who say, there's no God. I don't believe in God, or, I don't have the belief in God. So how is it possible for there to be self-described atheists who say they don't believe in God if Anselm is now going out of his way to say and argue that that's not even possible? He says it's impossible for someone to think that God doesn't exist. So how do you make that consistent with the evident fact that there are, after all, people who say they don't believe in God? Because according to Anselm, that's impossible. God's too great for anybody to think he doesn't exist. Well, how's he going to say that when, after all, it seems like there are a large number of people who make that exact claim? All right, what's he going to say here? Well, he has a kind of interesting way of getting around that problem. Here's what he says. He says, so in the mind and speech of the non-believer, the atheist, who he calls the fool, he says, maybe they say the words, there's no God, or they think the thought, there's no God. But he says, when they're saying those words or thinking those thoughts, they must not really be thinking of the real being, the real God. They must be thinking of some other being of a lower order, and they're just using the word God to refer to that thing. So his way of kind of evading this problem is by saying that the atheist, it technically doesn't count as a thought that God doesn't exist because they're not even thinking about God himself. You'd rather say it in this way. They're thinking that, quote unquote, God does not exist, where the scare quotes mean that whatever idea they have right there It's not the actual legitimate idea of God himself. Like if I held this marker up and I said, wow, what do you guys think of this dog? You'd probably be like, yikes, this man does not know what the word dog means. He's using it to refer to what we all understand is a marker. So in the same way, Anselm claims that when an atheist says there's no God, they must mean, there's no such thing as fill in the blank, something, but they're using the typical label God to refer to this other being. And thanks there for the comment, JM. I appreciate that. We got one live viewer. It's always nice to have someone check in. But yeah, so anyway, that's his point. He's saying that, despite the appearance to the contrary, that people say there's no God, they're not even really thinking about the correct concept. So that doesn't actually stand as an example of somebody diminishing the greatness of God by thinking he doesn't exist. They may say they don't think this, but their words don't actually mean the correct concept, and so it doesn't apply. I'll read then what he's saying, and he says it here in the passage. How indeed has he said in his heart what he could not think? Or how could he not think what he said in his heart, since to say in one's heart and to think are the same? But if he really, indeed, since he really both thought because he said in his heart and did not say in his heart because he could not think, then there is not only one sense in which something is said in one's heart or thought. Now here's the key passage. In one sense, a thing is thought when the word signifying it is thought. In another sense, when the very object which the thing is understood. In the first sense, then, when you're just thinking about a word, in that sense God can be thought not to exist, but not at all in the second sense. No one, understanding what God is, can think that God does not exist, even though he may say those words in his heart, either with no meaning or with a different meaning, because God is that than which nothing greater can be thought. Whoever really understands this understands clearly that this same being so exists that not even in thought can it not exist. Thus, whoever understands that God exists in this way cannot think of him as not existing. And then he finishes by saying, thank you, Lord, I give thanks, since what I believed before through your gift, I now understand through your illumination. Okay, so to sort of finalize our thoughts here, let me just summarize all the major points. We've talked today about an argument that's been presented. It's historically important by the author St. Anselm about 1,000 years ago from his book, The Proslogion. And he tries to make the argument that God exists based simply on the definition or idea of God. He says, people thinking about God generally assign to him all the highest qualities, that he's all-knowing, powerful, perfectly benevolent, and always present. And if you think about those qualities, that means you're thinking about the greatest conceivable being. He says, whether a person's a believer or a non-believer, they can at least concede the point that the definition of God is that it's thought of as the greatest conceivable being. Afterward, he says, okay, so next, some things only exist in the mind, like tooth fairies and leprechauns and dragons. Some things exist in the mind and in reality, like a regular horse or, the Eiffel Tower or the moon. But in his view, it's greater to exist in both the mind and in reality than to merely exist in the mind. So if God's the greatest conceivable being, which kind of thing would he be? Only in the mind or in the mind and in reality? Since it's greater to exist in both, the greatest conceivable being would have to exist in both. And he thinks that's enough to prove, just based on this definition and this logical maneuver alone, that God is real and he's not just in your head. Now, on the next section, he says, furthermore, God cannot even be thought not to exist, because things which can be thought not to exist are on that account less great than things which can't be thought of to not exist. So again, given his definition and given that it's greater to be not capable of being thought not to exist, God must be incapable of being thought non-existent. In other words, you can't think that he doesn't exist. And then the final part is, well, what about those that say of themselves, I don't believe in God? He's telling you that that's not even a possibility, so how can he square that circle? Well, in his view, the way of getting around that issue is to say that in the mind or mouth of a non-believer, the word God isn't referring to the real thing. So when they say there's no God, they're not actually expressing the true thought that there's no such thing as God. That thought's not possible anyway. They must be thinking that some other being is capable of not existing, but their word doesn't signify the real thing. Now, here's the only one point I want to leave you with as I just kind of reflect on the argument. So I find there's a little tension in two major points within his argument. On the one hand, he starts by saying, look, everybody has the same definition of God. You could be a believer, you could be an atheist, but we can all agree that God is defined as the greatest conceivable being. But then now late in the paper, he says, But atheists, they must not have the right idea of God if they're going to make these claims that God doesn't exist, because God cannot be thought of that way. He's too great to be thought of that way. So here's what I don't quite understand. Didn't he say at the beginning that everybody has the same idea of God when that suits the purposes of his argument? But then later on, when that gets him into trouble because he tries to say that's not possible to think God doesn't exist, it seems like now he's switching tactics and saying, well, the atheist doesn't have the right idea of God anyway. So which one is it then? I ask Anselm. Is it that atheists have the same idea that we all have of God, and it's a universal idea? Or is it that some people just don't have this proper idea of God, and that's why their thoughts that he doesn't exist kind of don't count? It sounds to me almost as though he kind of wants to have it both ways. On the one hand, to say that everybody has the same concept of God. On the other hand, that maybe actually the atheist doesn't have that right idea. And you're making a good point there in the chat, JM. Yeah, maybe he's moving the goalposts just a little bit in a sense, saying that, well, now maybe I need to change my assessment of whether an atheist really has the idea of God or not, because I don't want to have to, state that there's a possibility for people to think that there's no such thing as God. I don't know. I mean, it is a perhaps problematic element of the argument. I'm sure that if it was him, if I could bring him back to life and have him speak, he would probably say something like, well, all I meant was that people who really have the correct idea of God understand that he's the greatest conceivable being. But then that would almost make it seem as though it's not something that we can bridge across divides, because we have to be able to establish to our atheist friends, if we have those, that there's a common basis of agreement that we can use to then supply the remainder of the argument from. I don't know, just food for thought, something interesting to consider. But I'm going to let you guys go. This was really all I had for us today. We'll be back soon. I'll post another lecture over the weekend, and that one's going to deal with another major argument written throughout history about the existence of God, and that's the cosmological argument. Now, these different arguments, they have different strategies to try and make that same point that God exists. In my view, we'll get to the objections later, but I do think there's significant areas where this argument could be challenged. I think a better, higher quality argument to try and prove God's existence is this next one that we will be looking at. If it was me and I was, trying to make a solid proof to someone that God existed, I would probably be more likely to lean on this next argument that we'll cover. That's the cosmological argument that's coming next. This one, many people believe it sounds as though it's just playing with words, or it's kind of just a little loophole or something. If you accept the definition of God as the greatest conceivable being, then the rest of it all just follows from the definition alone. The next argument, though, I think is a little bit more persuasive, because it just relies on the general idea that everything has to have a cause. For something to exist, something had to cause it to exist. For there to be a human like you or me, we had to have parents, and they had to have parents. And going back and back and back, something has to be the cause that generates the effect of whatever exists. So that idea is then just extrapolated out to the whole universe. The universe is something which exists clearly. And if it has to have a cause, then the author of that argument says the only possible explanation is something that's separate from the universe. And what could that possibly be? It would have to be some kind of great, necessary being that the universe depends on. And that is another way to try and make the case of God's existence. I think of that as just a better argument, at least personally, because it only relies on common intuitions that we usually all have about cause and effect, and the idea that things have an explanation or an origin if you go back far enough. So, I'll leave you then to think a little bit more about it. Try to make sure you read all these posts that I've put out there for us. But for the time being, just have a great day, nice couple of days, and I'll be back in touch with you over the weekend. Don't forget to submit that first essay assignment that's due on Thursday before the end of the day. And anybody looking for any kind of help, guidance, or anything else, please reach out to me, and I'll be able to help if I can. Okay, then. So thanks again. Thanks for watching. Appreciate you tuning in, and I'll be in touch. So see you next time.